southbound Highway 51 comes through here like this now. So it's right at the intersection of Front Street and Oneida, where Dairy building is, which is the Mexican restaurant now. That's just about exactly right. This photo is probably, it may be the earliest photo taken of Minocqua. We don't have many early photos of Minocqua, not many at all, prior to 1900 or even 1905. And unfortunately, this is a rather poor photograph, but it does give you some idea of what things looked like. This is looking east, about right, they're probably standing about next to that grocery store I'm talking about and looking east. And this is along this side of the tracks is where the first buildings were built. Now these buildings are along Front Street. There's Front Street. Try driving your car or anything down that street. It looks like a mess. But this is very early. So this is after lots went up for sale and people bought lots along Front Street and could start building buildings. Now the first hotel to be built in Minocqua was the Union House, right here. It's a two-story hotel built by P.J. O'Malley. Now that hotel building was moved here in 1891, the spring of 1891. So it did sit on the north side of the tracks for 2.5 years. And then in the spring of 1891, it was moved to this lot here on Front Street. This is the landmark, or what was called the Minocqua House back then. It sat there, this building remained there until it burned in 1953. And it was destroyed, or I'm sorry, 54. It was, October 53, it was destroyed in a fire or severely damaged. It was torn down. And then now there's a one-story building on that site that Wisconsin Insurance Associates was in for a long time. At the time of the fire in 53, it was occupied by Newville Insurance Agency and the Rainbow Cafe. Now, most of these buildings along Front Street were saloons and some hotels. One of them was Archie McLaren's Saloon and Body House. McLaren had run a saloon and body tent in the construction camp, and when the camp closed down, he moved into the village. He ran into legal trouble, of course, and he did leave town, and then Johnson and Gustafson bought his building, and they turned it into what was called the European House Hotel, with a saloon on the first floor. The last two-story building that you can see in this row of buildings on Front Street is on the corner of Chippewa. Chippewa comes out here, so it's on the other side of Chippewa. It's the building I've marked there, that two-story building is called the Briggs House. That also was a hotel, and the history says that that hotel was built on water reserve land and moved to that lot after Briggs, actually McBride, bought the lot. Now I don't know where it would have been on water reserve land, so evidently it didn't sit on the depot grounds. It sat off the depot grounds, probably up to the north here, and then was moved onto this site in 1890. Another early building in town was the Lakeview House. This was built by Frank Reamer. He actually built this Lakeview House before owning the lots, before lots went up for sale. The history says that he built this in the spring of 1888. Lots went up for sale in May of 1888. He did end up buying the lots that the building was on. This photo was taken in 1905 or 1906. And so by this time, it was no longer being operated as a hotel. It had only lasted about 8 years or so that it was operated as a hotel, and then it became a personal residence. At the time of this photo was the personal residence of C.W. Hoover, the publisher of the Minocqua Times. And he had, by the time of this photo, moved the building 100 feet to the south. You will hear of the buildings a lot of buildings being moved. Buildings were moved around all the time. And part of the reason why that was possible is that they weren't built on foundations. They were built on timber, on timber stringers. And it wasn't until about 1900 that the buildings being built in town started to be built on foundations. And about that time, all the other buildings started getting converted, where they started digging foundations under them. So anyway, it would have been, and there's no sewer hookup, there's no electric, there's no water, there aren't any hookups. So you just move it. And I wish I'd see some pictures, could see some photos of how they did that, because again, that wasn't mechanized. They didn't have diesel trucks to move this. This was horses and probably logs for rollers. It'd be interesting to see how they did it. But it was moved 100 feet to the south, just because he wanted it to be closer to Milwaukee Avenue. And that's a little better picture of that early resort. That was one of the early resorts in town, and hotel. It was operated primarily as a fishing resort. Well, let me go back. You can see the very early part. This is Thirsty Whale in 1905. It started in 1903. It was called Hoover and Winger. So back to Front Street. On the west end of Front Street, you can see two buildings here, two substantial buildings. They're hard to tell apart because they're roof. I guess I wanted to talk, let's see. A couple photos of the depot before we get back to Front Street. So there are two buildings here, straddling Flambeau Street. They're both on Front. There's this one and that one. They're hard to tell apart because their roof lines happen to match up on this photo. The one to the right was, let's take the one to the left. That's because that one was built first. This is the Lakeside House, built by Pat and Mary Madden from Wausau. They bought two lots on this corner right when they first went up for sale in May of 1888, and immediately started building this hotel called the Lakeside House. They initially built this section of it, about the western 2/3 or 60% that they built. That's Pat Madden and his wife Mary and their two young sons sitting there. This is Pat Madden and Mary with a couple of fishermen and their catch. This is a fishing guide. Now, I'm pretty certain that this is John Mann, but a young E.D. Kennedy actually looked a lot like that too. But E.D. Kennedy, known as Ray Kennedy, and not the Ray Kennedy many of you know, that was his grandfather I'm talking about. E.D. Kennedy, as far as I can tell, first came to Minocqua in 1896. This is a very early photo, probably, I think, before they even added on to the Lakeside House. Because the windows, when they added on, they changed the front windows, and these are the original windows. So this is very early, and that's probably John Mann. Could have been taken while John still had his fishing resort across the lake. Now across the street from them, across Flambeau Street, is this substantial building built by Sherman Bardwell of Plainfield. He did not live in Minocqua. He lived in Plainfield, never moved here. He just wanted to invest in real estate here, and he built this building to rent. And it was rented right from the start. It was occupied, this whole first floor, occupied as a general store for years. And they probably used the upstairs then for the general store owners' residence. that building still exists. And back at the time of this photo, it was located directly across the street from today's post office. Obviously, it's not there anymore, but that building is here in town. So it's here because it was moved. In 1896, Bolger Brothers bought the store that was being operated, the general store that was being operated in this building, and they also then bought the real estate from Sherman Bardwell. And they continued to operate their store there. Then in 1900, they moved their store to Oneida Street. This is the first brick building built in Minocqua. This was in 1900. Bolger Brothers moved their store, which was more a general store, department store. They moved it here. Next to them, or 2 lots down, on the corner, this is where T. Murtaugh's is now, this livery stable. That's where that building, this building, was moved. It was moved to where this livery stable is in 1904. Bolger Brothers moved it there. They bought the livery stable. At the time of this photo, the livery stable was still owned by Doyle and McGonigal. Now this livery stable was then moved across, in 1904, moved across the street on the other side of Milwaukee Avenue. But where this livery stable is, that isn't its first location. It was moved to this spot in 1896. It had started out being a block east where the Lakeland Times office is now, Lakeland Times building. That's where McGonigal, Doyle and McGonigal first had this livery stable. They moved the building to this, added on to its front, and then in 1904, Bolger Brothers moved it across the street again to the south, and moved the store building here. So you can see the store in that position. Here's that's the Sherman Bardwell building. Here's the brick Bolger Brothers store. Both those buildings were set 8 feet, the fronts of both those buildings were set 8 feet back from the sidewalk. That can be seen more on this picture from this angle, from this vantage point. You can see that the brick store building is set 8 feet back from the sidewalk. They did the same thing with this building. But then in 1935, when O'Leary, J.E. O'Leary owned this building, he owned the former Bolger Brothers brick building. He added on to it. He extended it 8 feet to the sidewalk and then doubled its size by adding on to the north. So that is what was the J.E. O'Leary building. And then in the 36, Bolger Brothers, or I think by that time it was probably just T.M. Thomas Bolger that owned it, because this was his residence on the second floor. They extended that building 8 feet to the sidewalk too. If you go into T. Murtaugh's, you can still see evidence of the fact that that building was extended by 8 feet. You can see in there that where it originally ended. So they took the front of it off, extended it 8 feet, and then in 1936 they also did this motif, the Tudor or Old English type motif. That dates back actually to 1935. It was done first at the Minocqua House, and we'll be looking at that soon. So let's talk about the Minocqua House. That's a prominent building that's still here in town. It's this one on Front Street. So it was built in 1889, June of 1889. That's well documented. The Minocqua Times started publishing in April of 91. So it's hard to tell when buildings were built prior to that time. Certainly once the paper started publishing, we have good contemporaneous records of people building buildings. Prior to that time, not. In this case, though, with the Minocqua House, there were notes in Merrill and Wausau papers about the construction of this hotel. So we know it was built in May and June of 1889. Initially, it was just the north half, and there's no picture that shows just the north half. But this ad that was in the Minocqua Times does show it. That's how it looked initially. Then, and then I'm quite certain that this photo of the railroad depot was taken while just that north half of the Minocqua house existed. But the photo didn't extend far enough off to the right to confirm that. So then in 1893, they doubled its size. They added a south half. So this, again, this ad that was in the Minocqua Times shows that. There is no early photograph like this that shows this, but this ad does show it. Now, that addition in 1893 did not extend the entire length of the building. You can see on this 1916 photo that was taken from the top of a scaffold in 1916. Right here is where the south half of the building ends, and it only went like 50 feet back from the street. In 1936, it was extended all the way back because there were bowling alleys in the landmark. So in 1936, that's where they put the bowling alleys. They extended the south half of the building all the way back, and there were bowling alleys back there. So here's a little later photo of the Minocqua. It was called the Minocqua House. It was called the Minocqua. It was called the Minocqua Hotel. Then later Belle Isle in the 30s, and in our times the landmark. This is taken about 1905. That's, I think, when this nice porch all the way across the front and down the side appeared. This is later in the 30s, about 1930 itself, when it was known as the Belle Isle. And here you can see that old Union House that burned down in 53, that was moved from the railroad depot grounds. And this is taken shortly after the exterior of the Belle Isle was remodeled, and this was the first building in town that used the Tudor or Old English motif. That was done in 1935. Now the other building that's prominent in this photo of Front Street is this one. This is the Schilling building, where the Schilling drugstore was in later years. Ed and John Schilling were businessmen from Fifield, and when Minocqua was established, and they had a general store in Fifield, they opened one in Minocqua. This is their building in about 1890. And actually, when they first built their general store here in Minocqua, they built it a block to the south, kind of out in the boondocks. There was nothing down there back then. So they must have realized their mistake, because after less than a year of having their building down there, they moved it. They moved the building. This is their building that they moved up the block towards the depot. They didn't move it to the corner, but they moved it to lot 2. The corner lot here is lot 1. They moved it to lot 2. Now, in 1891, they stopped operating their own general store in that building and started leasing it. And so from 1897 on, it was being leased to druggists who ran a drugstore there. And then in 1903, Frank Schilling bought the Schumacher drugstore, and it became Schilling Drugs in 1903. So this was one of the earlier druggists that leased it, Coordinat, and this is after Schilling's then established their own drugstore in it in 1903. This photo is probably 1905. That's Frank Schilling. This is just such a neat picture of him sitting in this buggy. Sorry, I didn't want to take it off there quite that fast. So that's him sitting in front of his store. It's possible that it's closer to 1903 when they actually did establish their own business in it, and he wanted a photo because he was proud of having a store there. And here too is another view of it looking down Oneida Street. There's the Schilling drugstore. Now, all these buildings, the Schilling drugstore and all the buildings down to this point, got burned in that 1912 fire. So everything along Front Street and then up this street to this point were burned down. Then other building on Front Street that's notable, although you can't see it in this photo. It's in this washed out area, right in the middle of the block. There was a meat market that was operated right away. It's notable because that's where the first school classes were held in Minocqua in the school year of 1888 to 89. See, when Minocqua was established in 1888, first of all, there was just one county here, Novalis County. Oneida County encompassed what is now Vilas County too. And there were only two townships. And we were in the town of Rhinelander, or Pelican Lake. The city of Rhinelander was in that township. So we were under their governmental control. We didn't have control over funds to build a schoolhouse in 1888. And so we didn't have a school that first school year. The school, or the meat market, was located where this arrow is, where the Schlitz Opera House was built later. And in fact, the meat market was moved, the building was moved in 1899 to make room to construct the Schlitz Opera House. But that's where it was. It was a 1.5-story building, and classes were held in the second floor, which must have been more like an attic, as a 1.5-story meant there weren't vertical walls on the second floor. It was just the roof. And that's where classes were held the first year. Then in 1889, this schoolhouse was built. It was built on the east end of Milwaukee Avenue, where the old fire barn is, and it was a one-room schoolhouse. This is it, but this is after it had been purchased and moved by the Methodists. This was the Methodist Church until 1950. So this, again, another example of a building being moved. By 1894, it was no longer adequate for the number of students in town, the number of pupils, and so that was sold to the Methodist congregation, and a two-room schoolhouse was built in 1894. This photo shows the meat market building. Now this is where Polecat and Lace was in later years. This is on the corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Oneida Street. Incidentally, what's going on here is a circus parade. This is in 1909. So this shows that meat market building, and it shows it after a full second story was added. So when it was moved here, it was a 1.5-story in 1899. In 1902, it was a full second floor was added to it, and that's what this photo shows. Now on this photo, there's